This is the 7th interval lecture, and these interval lectures are a meta-punctuation. They're a superscript that's laid over the educational program. The educational program has 8 seasons of 12 lectures each over a 2-year period. And punctuating each of those seasons is a holiday, a 13th week, and there are 8 of them. And these 8 interval lectures together constitute a form in and of themselves. They would be known today as an indexing form. That is to say, if you took the possible permutations of the rest of the course in the 8 12-week sections, a mathematical key insight into analytical processing of that possibility, which is not only large, it's rather infinite. The 8 interval lectures together would constitute an index which would allow you to have some way of an ingress into the material and progressively expand your understanding. And theoretically, your understanding is as infinite as the possibilities. And you would achieve a parity with the material, no matter how complex or extensive it was, at some point in this kind of process. Now, this strategy in mathematics was first written down in an intelligent form by a man named Gauss, G-A-U-S-S. And it had been a wisdom procedure in ancient times. But Gauss found that in a linear and multilinear algebraic situation, there is a process for finding solutions of any system, even if there's simultaneity involved, by taking a single variable and introducing that for solution into the complexity. And by withdrawing, by subtracting, by excerpting out the results of that processing of the first variable, you can then come back with a second variable and apply the same technique, and eventually one will bring, even out of chaos, even out of infinite complexity, an increasing probability of understanding what the situation is and how to manage it, how to work with it. One of the all-time great human beings who used a methodology similar to this was the historical Buddha. And the historical Buddha lived about 2,600 years ago. The 2500th anniversary of the Buddha was in 1956. And that year was called the Buddha Jayanti. It means the commemoration of the victory of the Buddha. The historical Buddha was actually a prince. He was the prince of a clan called the Sakyas. And the Sakyas were a very ancient people who were not from India originally. They had moved to India about 1,000 years before in the northern part of India, in the foothills of the range just before the Himalayas, and in a place called Lumbini. The historical Buddha was born as Siddhartha Gautama, in the clan of the Sakyas. Now, the Sakyas were an ancient Iranian stock of people, and they were from Central Asia. They were from the other side of Tibet. You can imagine how huge Tibet is, and on the southern curve of Tibet are the Himalayas, and below them several other lower ranges, and just below them where the Sakyas lived in the Buddha's time. Well, 1,000 years before, the Sakyas had come from the other side of the Tibetan plateau. And just as the Himalayas range along the bottom of Tibet, India, on the top of Tibet, China, are the Kunlun Mountains. And at the base of the Kunlun Mountains were ancient civilization, and those people were called Aryans. And the name comes from an ancient name, and it simply means noble ones. It means persons who have a transformation built into their culture. The transformation being to a higher order of life, to a life where symbols are as important as rituals. Essentially, in ancient times, that's what it meant. The center of that ancient civilization, some 2,000 years before the Buddha, was a place where two rivers that came out of the Kunlun Mountains met. And that place in ancient times was called Hotan, and today in China it's called Heian. And that place where the two rivers come together, one of the rivers is called the White Jade River, and the other is called the Black Jade River. And the Kunlun Mountains in that region, back of Hotan, are extremely high. They go up to almost 24,000 feet, so it's really quite a range. And because of the peculiarity of geology, it's one of the few regions on the planet where the striations of a mineral, which is generally called jade, were exposed to surface weathering. And so bits of split off jade throughout the geological eras would fall into these ice moraine flows from the huge Kunlun mountain glaciers. And over long eons, they would be carried down in the meltwater that would collect into these two rivers, and these two rivers, by coming very close together where Hotan was, would deposit jade, and the very first place on the planet where jade was found in a natural form was there at Hotan in these rivers. And the jade was of a very specific property. It had the white jade especially, had an oily kind of smoothness to it. And today it's called mutton fat jade. And so in order to find the jade pebbles in the streams, women would take their shoes off and they would walk barefooted in the sandy, rocky beds of the White Jade River, and they would feel with their toes, and they would feel for the jade particles, and then bring them out. And so jade was first found in this way. So that there was always an iconography of mystery, of mountains, of streams, of barefooted searching, of the quality that somehow in special places secrets of nature would be delivered up. And so the Sakya clan, coming from these ancient people, in some regions around Samarkand, they were even called the Sakas, without the Y. Saka, Sakya. So the Buddha was born into a clan whose wisdom went back many thousands of years, and who had been in India for about 1,000 years when he was born. And in this culture, there was always a hierarchy, And the hierarchy was maintained by a matrilinear descent. Not that women ran the tribes, but that the woman's son could only be king. So that very often the king, the ruling king, his sister's son would become the next king, not his own son. And so in a very peculiar kind of a way, the Buddha's, that is to say Siddhartha's mother, was the carrier of the noble lineage. And this is why the mythologies about the Buddha are always about Queen Maya, about his mother, and his father is almost not mentioned at all. This, incidentally, is a very deep archetypal pattern, and this is why Jesus' mother is often mentioned and his father almost never mentioned. This deep pattern that somehow those individuals who are born to this capacity to have a very high level of transcendent symbolic wisdom come from a lineage which is carried matrilinearly. Now this shows up in the Buddha in a very interesting way. One of the most prominent of all of the monks who took up following the Buddha later on in his life was his own son Raula, because Raula would never become king. The kingship would have passed to Gautama's sister, had he have had a sister, her son. Now for Siddhartha, he was in line to become king. And in those ancient cultures, you were trained from birth to accept the responsibilities of that position. And up until the age of 28, Siddhartha had been trained perfectly. Notice that the age 28 is 4 cycles of 7. In ancient training, you always went through 7-year cycles. It's curious, but even the body's cells seem to follow a 7-year cycle. They renew themselves every 7 years. So that physiologically, your body doesn't have a single cell in it that's older than 7 years. How do you know who you are? Come on now. You see? And so the Buddha had gone through 4 of these 7-year cycles, 7 4-year cycles, 4 7-year cycles. And in his 28th year, one of the requirements for being a king was to have exposure to the hard life of the people. Now, in later mythology, the monks would have it that the Buddha had slipped out over the wall to go and visit the common people. But this was not in keeping with the way in which kingship was done in ancient times. He was simply shown at the appropriate age that this is what you have to deal with, for a king has to be clear-eyed. And Siddhartha, who had been raised in this very special, contained way, the pleasures of the palace, the high ideals of the pleasure gardens, was exposed suddenly to the maimed and crippled and death-ridden realities of ordinary people. And of course, for a wisdom being, this sticks in your throat. There's no way to swallow, there's no way to dismiss this. And the natural compassion, that is the substrate of wisdom, rises and forbids one to go any further. And so Siddhartha made the decision that he would give up the kingship. And he, against all of his wife, his young son, his mother, his father, his friends, his compeers. All of their protestations were of no avail. And so at 28, Siddhartha, accompanied only by his faithful charioteer, whose name was Channa, rode off in the royal prince's chariot, and he was deposited on the banks of a river at a yogic ashram, where he would take off his royal garments and put on a mendicant's robe and pursue the strenuous yogic exercises, the asanas. And for 7 years, for another 7-year cycle, for a fifth 7-year cycle, Siddhartha went from ashram to ashram, from yoga teacher to yoga teacher, and none of them were of any avail. For they could teach the Hatha Yoga, and they could teach the Karma Yoga, and they could teach the Jnana Yoga, and even occasionally there is a yogi who can teach the Raja Yoga. But those 4 yogas are for mastering the qualities of this world. That unseen 5th yoga, that quintessential, invisible yoga, has nothing to do with this world at all. And this was where the stuck voice of Siddhartha existed. It existed in a realm that was not amenable to the 4 yogas of this world. And realizing that he had run through the complete cycle of teachers, that none of them could help him, none of them could provide that solution, Siddhartha decided on his own to force himself into enlightenment. And so he made a vow to take no more nourishment whatsoever, that he would die or be enlightened. And he reached a condition where he was only bones and skin, and fell on his face in the dust, and would have died there, except an old woman, a peasant woman, who knew nothing about enlightenment or yoga, mixed a little bit of rice with her saliva and forced it into his mouth, and brought him over several weeks back to some low modicum of life by this process. And coming back out of his own giving up, Siddhartha began to understand that there was no power in him for enlightenment, that in fact enlightenment cannot be had. It is not something that can be had. It cannot be found. It cannot be achieved. It cannot be forced. There's no it. It doesn't have existence. The mind has no way of interfacing with it. And there is nothing whatsoever that one can do. And so Siddhartha, faced with this mystery, decided to simply open himself up to the mystery and let it wash over him. And when he had gained whatever was there to be gained, he would go home. He positioned himself in the forest, and he sat under a tree. I believe that the first tree was a muchalinda tree. It had beautiful flowers. He sat there, and for a period of 7 days he sat under this first tree. And as he sat there, the realization that he would never achieve enlightenment, for there was nothing to achieve, ebbed from him. And as it ebbed from him, his surrender energy, instead of being funneled to an act of self-destruction, simply opened up again and funneled the other way into an affirmation without bounds. He then sat under a second tree for another 7 days, and a third tree for a third 7 days. And while he was sitting under this third tree, a huge thunderstorm came up, and lightning was striking very nearby. And this huge old cobra came out of the ground and wrapped itself around Siddhartha and placed its hood over his head. Should there be any lightning, that the naga the cobra would carry the lightning and by its tail send it into the ground, which it did. And coming out of this deep meditation, after the third level of surrender, Siddhartha sat under the fourth tree, which was a ficus tree, the Bodhi tree. And so the Bodhi tree was the fourth, not the only tree, but the fourth tree. And as he sat under the fourth tree, there was not a single speck of expectation. There was not a single image. And for a cycle of 7 days, for a week, notice that the week is a sacred form of time, nothing happened whatsoever. And at the end of that 7-day period, it occurred to Siddhartha that the reason why nothing had happened is that there was no one there for anything to happen to. He realized there was also no universe in which events could happen. And as these formless impressions, wisps of consciousness were playing, 2 merchants, 2 businessmen on a trip came into the grove, and they saw Siddhartha under the tree in the glow of the being there. And so they asked him for some small teaching which would help them in their lives. And they offered him food in a bowl. And in the recounting of this later in his life, Siddhartha, now become the Buddha, taught for about 45 years. And long time into his teaching career, he remembered and he gave this kind of description of the pattern of events that fell like a gentle, dazzling rain. He felt great compassion for these 2 beings because their asking for some smidgen of help in their lives was genuine. The asking was without any guile whatsoever, and the offering of food to him in a bowl was without any guile whatsoever. But it occurred to Siddhartha, become now the Buddha, that he had no hands with which to accept this bowl of food, and that he had no stomach with which to digest this food. He had no voice with which to speak to these men, and he had nothing whatsoever to say. And so, realizing all of this, he simply accepted the food and began to eat and began to speak to the men. And this was the first delivering of teaching. Now, whole sediments of ocean deposits have covered this up, but the original teaching of the Buddha was to businessmen. not the monks. The first movement out of enlightenment, not out of enlightenment, but the first movement of enlightenment in action, which makes it exist, is to ordinary people. We found in our education that movement, an action, is the trigger that causes existence to manifest. And even pre-existent, non-existent enlightenment, when it moves, it exists. When it's simply done, then it exists. If one stopped doing, its substrate of existence would no longer occur. This is what is meant then by turning the Dharma chakra. When someone turns that chakra, the chakra of Dharma, as long as it is turned, enlightenment exists and is available in this world, in this realm, in this universe. If the Dharma chakra is not turned, its substrate of existence winks out, no longer occurs, and leaves no trace whatsoever. After teaching for 45 years, the historical Buddha passed into what is called parinirvana. Para is the ancient name for beyond, and one of the most realistic of all ways, of all language labels to talk about the way of the Buddha is the Parayana. Not the Hinayana or the Mahayana or the Vajrayana, but simply the Parayana, the way beyond. Whenever referring to his actuality, the Buddha referred to himself as the Tathagata, the one whose suchness has gone. Suchness gone. Where has it gone? It is gone. It is not here. And so Tathagata was the term that he used. But a Tathagata, as long as he continues to teach, the teachings exist. After his parinirvana, for about 100 years, there were just several hundred individuals who passed on by word of mouth what had happened, what they had heard, and on the 100th anniversary and the centenary of the parinirvana of the Buddha, a number of very old monks got together, and one of them was named Mahakasyapa. Now, Mahakasyapa, very old at this time, was the greatest black magic practitioner in ancient India. He was like the Simon Magus of the Buddha's time in India. And he wasn't called Mahakasyapa at that time. He was simply called Kasyapa. And his particular power was to be able to cause Kundalini energy to take whatever forms he wanted to have. And so he could literally bring out of a person's Kundalini energy any kinds of forms, illusions, delusions, emotional states whatsoever. If you control someone's Kundalini energy, you can do a lot of stuff. And he had 500 followers that he was training to make this army of super snake yogis to go and take over a situation. The perfect Nazi of his time. And single-handedly, like a Kurosawa Sanjuro character, Buddha, who was at this time about 60, 70 years of age, simply walked into Kasyapa's camp alone, unarmed. And made a very innocent, seemingly innocent request. He said, would you have some place that I could spend the night? And Kasyapa, thinking, I have heard of this character, I'm going to put him in his place. He said, yes, you can stay in my place, in my hut, if you can stand it, but there's a lot of weird energy in there. It has something to do with snakes. And so Siddhartha, become the Buddha, went in and sat and arranged himself, and as the old saying was, he arranged himself with the legs in a infinity sign motion and uncovered the right shoulder and the left shoulder, and he held the right shoulder even with it and went into deep samadhi. And so Kasyapa and all of his cohorts worked on that hut all night. And they conjured up all the snakes that Kundalini is capable of, but the snakes couldn't find any spinal column in order to wrap themselves around. And they, in the morning, stretching gracefully, the Buddha came out and went like this to Kasyapa. He said, I have some training for you that you might be interested in. And so Kasyapa followed him, and over the years became Mahakasyapa, one of the greatest of all the followers of the Buddha. Well, 100 years after the parinirvana, Mahakasyapa brought together a number of aged people who still remembered firsthand some of the sayings, some of the lectures, some of the sermons of the Buddha. And they collected at a place called Rajagraha, and there they recited a number of the remembered sermons, and out of that, certain pithy statements, certain pithy verses, certain pithy gathas were selected, and some 500 of them were put together and arranged and entitled the Dhammapada. Now, over time, 423 have survived. And so the Dhammapada that we have today for our 7th interval text, the Dhammapada has 423 verses from that time. That would have been about 2,400 years ago, about the time when Plato was teaching in Greece. In the Dhammapada, in the original Dhammapada, in the way in which the Pali language version of the Dhammapada down in Sri Lanka, in Ceylon, there were 26 little sections of the Dhammapada. Now, when it was translated into China, they expanded that to 39 sections. So it has had various shapes throughout the thousands of years of history in Asia. But out of the 26 shapes, the very first shape began with a pairing. It's called, in fact, the twin verses, and the phrase for it is the Yamaka Vaga. The Yamaka Vaga, the twin verses. And at the very beginning here is a mnemonic symbolic pattern where there are 10 pairs of verses that are arranged, and they're like a tuning fork. They're meant to bring your language capacity to a symbolic honing, where the pairs of verses are in equanimity, and when they're in complete equanimity, one hears the two verses together as a single expression. And having tuned 10 times in this way, you're then ready to hear the rest of the verses in a kind of linearity that is able to be cut into a jewel. And that's what the Dhammapada is. Pada means path. Pada, path. Notice how the language is ancient still. Our English word path still related to pada. Dhamma is the southern pronunciation, the Pali pronunciation of Dharma. Dhamma. And so Dharma path becomes Dhammapada. And to become a pedestrian on the Dhammapada, one has to walk in a fifth yoga. The 4 natural yogas are good enough for a linear path. They hone you so you can follow a linear path, but only someone who can transcend, who can recut the linearity into a jewel, can follow the parayana. And so the Dhammapada is a practice. It's like a tuning up practice for enlightenment. If you can follow the Dhammapada, then you will have discovered that you have transformed yourself. If you only hear the Dhammapada in a linear way, it means that you still have work to do. If you cannot hear the Dhammapada in a linear way, then you have to do some serious practice with some of the basic yogas, because you're missing out on even being able to follow linearity. And remember in our lectures in history, you must have a substrate of chronology before the differential person recuts history into a cosmos. So that the cosmos is always a jewel. It's never the end of the line. It's never a goal. It's never a purpose. It is always the jewel recut of everything brought together instantly and forever. The same with the Dhammapada. Same with enlightenment. The once and future jewel. So that one is going nowhere, but one is definitely precisely going along this path. But to expect that the path goes somewhere is naive. And to expect that someone else can teach you about that path is naive. And to look for teachers outside of yourself is very peculiar. Now, in the twin verses, in the beginning of the Dhammapada, in the Yamaka Vagga, this is the very first thing that they remembered to put at the beginning. The operative phrase is, our life is the creation of our mind. Our life is the creation of our mind. Now, this particular phrase is suspect. It's true in this world, but its worldly truth vanishes in a fifth yoga and reappears mysteriously. So that it is true, then it is not true, and because it was both true and not true, then it is real. What? Milarepa used to do that, and he used to smile. This gold jeweled earrings. It's first true, and then it is not true, and then it is real. And we'll get to that after the break. It comes under the heading of Appamada Vagga, heedfulness, the way of heedfulness. So at the beginning of the Dhammapada, at the beginning of the 26 sections, the very first section is called Twin Verses, and the second section is called Heedfulness. And so you begin by tuning up, and right after that you follow it by reminding yourself to be heedful. Now the core of heedfulness, the very core of it, is that there's a snowflake of process that needs to melt all at once. And this snowflake, it has 6 flanges, just like a snowflake. And each of those flanges is called a paramita, a perfection. So that the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections, are there as the jewel of heedfulness. Why would Mahakasyapa, in his old age at Rajagraha, remember that the Buddha had taught essentially to make a jewel out of the processes of perfection? Would one not follow the processes of perfection to perfection? No. It's the height of ignorance to follow processes of perfection to perfection. Just like it is the height to follow a truth path to truth. There's no end to a truth path. There's no purpose to it whatsoever. The ignorant are absolutely right. This leads nowhere. Wisdom leads nowhere. But they are completely naive because keeping on precisely a path that leads nowhere leads to enlightenment. If it led somewhere, you wouldn't be enlightened, you would get where you were going. But to be going assiduously nowhere, constantly, eternally, is itself an enlightened, conditionless reality. Now, this is very difficult to hear. And one cannot hear it because hearing is based upon a linear organization of sounds that code an image base that makes some kind of sense. And enlightenment doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Existence is created by actions, by ritual. An integrated experience is life. And the creation by the mind has to do with symbols. Now there are 2 objectivities that pair themselves up, like the twin verses, right away, and that is the body and the psyche. They're both objective. The body and the psyche. The body because of ritual, the psyche because of symbols. Psyche and symbol, body and ritual. You can make a little mantra for yourself, and you can pronounce it in any accent that you want. Ritual body, symbolic psyche. That this is a twin verse. This is a tuning fork in and of itself. The psyche is objective just like the body. Now if you get into some deep, comprehensive therapeia, say like a Jungian therapeia, one of the requirements for its operative effectiveness is that one deal with the psyche as an object, the objective psyche. In other words, the psyche is not a process, but is objective. What is the process then? If the psyche is not a process, one can say, well, the mind is the object of the psyche's process. Is that not so? And this is not so. The psyche is the object, and of what process is the psyche the object? The process of language. What? You heard it. The process of language. Language has everything to do with experience, having a feeling-toned indexing capacity, which interiorizes and becomes the stuff of the psyche. The psyche is extremely objective. Symbols integrate the psyche into essences. Symbols distill experience into essences. And those essences are as real as any things. So that the twin verses that begin the Dhammapada are how to see in equanimity that the body and the psyche held in perfect balance, not like a teeter-totter, but a perfect balance, are a horizon. They're a horizon line that has a very peculiar quality. It has a circular chronology that is never ending. And there is a quality of recognizing that because this disk of never-endingness is only here by virtue of the balance, the perfect balance of body and psyche held in equanimity, that the spherical, unlimited context within which that disk occurs must be something other than the disk. We have to take a break there. Perhaps the machines can pick this up. It's a phrase out of Sanskrit, pradita samutpaya. It means the chain of dependent origination, the shackles that hold us in illusion have 12 links, and when they're linked together, it's a chain. And the phrase for that chain as an entirety is pradita samutpaya. The first link in the chain is ignorance. The 12th link in the chain is ignorance. So when ignorance makes an identification with itself, that welds the chain together. You cannot break that chain. You have to disappear so that the chain falls to the ground. There's no way to break that chain. Savvy? In order for you to disappear, you have to convince your ego that it's going to be all right. Because your ego is a great saboteur. When the Buddha was teaching, when the Dhammapada was put together and remembered, when all of these particular wisdom, high wisdom language qualities were posited, the awareness, like a super awareness, like a meta awareness, that the process itself has a tricky quality, and that the tricky quality is inherent in the way in which language works, was always uppermost. And so in the Dhammapada, one finds right away in the twin verses that the Buddha is aware that one of the qualities that most endanger us is equivocation, and that we mistake equivocation for identity, and identity for a guarantee of reality. And in this way, we are constantly distracted from truth. And because we are distracted from truth, it's not that untruth exists. Untruth doesn't exist at all. But untruth happens, and because it happens, it gets delegated existence, and on that basis we think that we can talk about something called falsity or untruth or evil. And all of that entire ensemble is an illusion. Personified, named Mara. Mara. Mara the tempter, or temptress. Why is Mara a tempter? Because it tempts us to believe in illusion. Notice how the telephone answering machine keeps working because someone keeps calling because someone doesn't understand that all that I ever do at this time is teach. That's it. Illusion is the same thing. It keeps on tempting us to believe on the basis of an appearance, which is confirmed by an identification, which is backed up by an equivocation, and isn't that supposed to be a basis for believing? So right away in the Dhammapada, first thing, Buddha gets this out of the way. And they remembered that this is first thing. So down to business. Because the body exists, because the psyche exists, because there's an equanimity possible between them, that horizon line of equanimity is a path. That's the natural, original path. How do you get from the body to the psyche? That horizon is very narrow. The only way that that path works is by language. Language links the body to the psyche. Now, if that's hard to understand, you have to take yourself in hand. Just grab your throat with one of your hands. Cuff one ear to get rid of the wax. The horizon linking the body with the psyche is language, and it forms a line. It forms a path. And in nature, that's how it works. This path, as one would follow it, works only one way. It integrates. It tends to telescope. Not to be a telescope, but to telescope. It wants to come together. It wants to funnel. That's what it likes. It likes to do that. Language likes to do that. Now, on this particular path, on this integral, the Buddha right away sends up a little flare so that we can see what's going on. He says, hate is conquered by love. And one says, right away, what's hate got to do with it? What's love got to do with it? What's going on here? He says, in fact, that this is law eternal. In some of the translations it reads that. The word is dharma. It's a true law in the sense of a universal principle, in the sense of a methodology which you can really count on working all the time. It works even mysteriously when it doesn't seem to be there. It still works. That is to say, in a polarized appearance, by bringing polarities together, they cancel each other out. That hate and love in this world are polarities that cancel each other out. It isn't that love triumphs. It's that love cancels out hate. And what then occurs will have whatever existence is there able to be under the conditions. One might say, instead of love and hate, one has an opportunity to disclose the real. Now this is fraught with peril. In one of the greatest screenplays ever written, James Agee, in Night of the Hunter, the character in the film is played by Robert Mitchum, a young, really perilously oily Robert Mitchum. Fantastic. He has love and hate written on his knuckles. And he has committed a murder. And the only witnesses are the children. And he's searching to find the children to kill them. But he's searching in a very quiet, nonchalant, preacher-type way because he has the appearance of a preacher. And in the screenplay, the children are hunkered down in this rowboat, floating in this culvert that's overflowing under this huge starry cosmos. And off in the night, one hears Mitchum, children, children. And one sees the silhouette of him on the horse with his preacher's cap, his hat, searching to kill. The ego is a preacher that has love and hate on its knuckles, and the ego can only operate with that religion. Under conditions of the real, the ego does not exist, cannot exist, no longer continues to happen. So if you have identified yourself with yourself, you're certainly not going to let anything jeopardize it. And this is what Mara counts on. Because Mara has no power whatsoever to create existence, only you do. And so Mara keeps whispering, you better keep us around. Those people are trying to get rid of us. You better get rid of them. You better not listen to this wisdom teacher too much. Who the hell is he? What does he think he is? It's only a Los Angeles afternoon. What do the kids today say? Yeah, sure. Right. The word for truth in ancient language in India was saram, saram. The word for untruth is asaram, 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 saram, asaram. The word to see was sare, sare. The word for imagine is asare, asare. Imagination is a polarity to perception. Imagination is a polarity to perception. You're not choosing one over the other. It's that when they're both brought together and aligned, they cancel each other out. They tend to displace one another. In ordinary, worldly happenings, they displace one another. The more one comes into play, the less the other. If you're driving in your car and you start to imagine and think of something else, you no longer see the road. If you're seeing the road, you're not imagining something else. Now, the polarity, conditioned training that passes for wisdom in this world is that you train yourself to be mindful of perception, and that's not very wise. Just to be mindful of perception and make sure that no imagination creeps in. The ego will take that. Oh, they like that. That's halfway truth. That's really great. But to have no perception and no imagination whatsoever at the same time, that's perilous for the ego. Because it's simply not going to occur, not going to be there. Seeing, sare, is an act of perception. The act of perception. You have to use the gerund, not see, but seeing. Seeing. Seeing, perception, is an active process. And it has all kinds of constructs. It has indexing. It even has symbolic capacities, creative capacities. It's never just automatically machine-like stimulus response. Never that. It's an activity. Seeing is an act of perception. Imagining is the feeling of perception. Imagining is the feeling of perception. So that images take precedence in experience, but perception takes precedence in the body. So they have to make a deal. They have to cut a deal. They have to figure out how to divvy this up. So that sare and asare, because of their deep relationship, tend to taint, to tinge, use the alchemical term, they tend to tinge the sense, the feeling for truth and untruth. Something is true because it feels right. Something is untrue, feels wrong. Or something is true because you see this. Seeing is believing. Or something is untrue because you see this. That entire ensemble is suspect. All of it is pratitya samutpaya. All of it. But there's no way to make your arm load big enough to take the whole ensemble and set it aside. Where are you going to put it? So you have to set yourself aside. You can't set that aside, so you have to set yourself aside. And if you set yourself aside from here to somewhere else, the illusion is somewhere else. It's wherever you put it. So to set yourself aside, you have to have an equanimity. You have to have a language path that links the body and the psyche that's just one strand. And then turn that on its sharpest edge, make it as narrow as possible, and then sever it by not speaking it. Poignant silence as the right punctuation is all you need. Now this is not possible as long as feeling is jumbled, as long as imagination is wild. There's no way to get language ordered, to get this clear line, to get the body and the psyche equanimous. So the Buddha, in the very beginning of the Dhammapada, notice we haven't gotten very far, we've got to the beginning. He says, if a man speaks but a few holy words, yet lives the life of those words, possessed by true knowledge, serene mind, he has his share in the real life. You don't need a lot. You don't need a whole lot. In fact, there's a quality that is put in here in the Dhammapada where it's called section 8, the thousands, where all the similes have to do with thousands. He says, better than 1,000 utterances composed of meaningless words is one sensible word, on hearing which one becomes peaceful. The ancient usage in India was Om. Om. One sensible word which engenders peacefulness is better than thousands and thousands of meaningless words. Notice now the Buddha is going to jump. He's going to index. He said, if a man, month after month, for 100 years, should sacrifice with 1,000 sacrifices each time, and if he but one instant pay homage to a man whose self is grounded in knowledge, better is that homage than all the sacrifice of 100 years. All the pujas in the universe are food for Mara. Mara loves it. In fact, Mara takes an alias called Lila. Dances. Great. Hooray. Something's going on. A show is happening. And when there's no show, when there's no audience, there are no dancers. There's no movement whatsoever. If one becomes not a spectator, but one becomes just the empty amphitheater, all those vast storms wink out and no longer occur. The Buddha for this talks about the self, attavago. Attavago is the self, the section on the self. He says, if a man holds himself dear, let him diligently watch himself. The wise man should be watchful during one of the 3 watches. Divide a 24-hour period into 8, 8, 8. During one of these watches, one of these 8-hour stints, just simply occur. It doesn't take very long once one gets a thin, simple line of language linking the body and the psyche. He says, the evil done by oneself, born of oneself, produced by oneself, crushes the fool even as a diamond breaks a precious stone. As a creeper overpowers the entwined sal tree, one of the 4 trees for his enlightenment, one of them was a sal tree, very tall, huge canopy, beautiful. Rustles in the wind and in the dusty sunlight of northern India used to line the great road that Ashoka built. As a creeper overpowers the entwined sal tree, he whose impiety is great reduces himself to the state which his enemy wishes for him. Now all of this, and you can see how the Dhammapada works. It not only has a linearity, which you would follow page by page, section by section, but one can go in like a diamond cutter, and one can take verse here, verse there, and rearrange them and bring them together spontaneously, instantly, and produce an infinite number of jewels from it. There's not only one jewel, but any amount of jewels can be made. One can even take just simply one verse and turn that one verse and see it from different angles, and one has a jewel there. So then a very high developed Vajrayana later, the Vajrayana means the jeweled path, the diamond path. One could take a single vowel and turn its facets and see jewel simply a whole jeweled cosmos in single vowel. That didn't originate with the Vajrayana, but originated at the beginning of the Mahayana. They were called Prajna Paramita texts. Some of them were very large, like 100,000 couplets. Some of them were smaller, 8,000 couplets. Some of them were like 200 couplets. One of them was single vowel. Ah, a, ah. As language interiorizes, as it goes inside, images condense, they telescope together. They do that all by themselves. Imagination gains powers in this process. Imagination, instead of just having a natural one-for-one referent, now begins to have, say, a double referent. One begins to have a sense that there is a pro and a con to each image, or multiplicities. And one begins to see that the natural appearance is rather like capable of an allegory, and that this allegorical quality then adds to the symbolic aspect of language, so that language structures feeling and interiorizes experience to a symbol, and in this way, mind creates life. In this way, mind creates life. Immediately as that is posited, immediately as the Dhammapada has that said, the second section comes into play on heedfulness. And the very beginning of heedfulness reads like this: heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedlessness is the path to death. The heedful do not die. The heedful do not die. The heedless are like unto the dead. The heedless keep calling, right? Because I want it, it should be there. Keep on and keep on and keep on. This is the way in which Mara, the ego, the pratitya samutpaya, the way it keeps going. Now, though you cannot break that, you can slow that down so that one can learn to even keep it just slow motion. In that dependent chain of origination, it begins in ignorance and goes through a whole series of 10 others and comes back, and the 12th is again ignorance. One can slip through and let that whole chain fall by going to the very center of that pattern, of that chain. And the only way that that chain maintains itself, the only way that pratitya samutpaya continues to move and thus exist, or seemingly exist, have the appearance of existence, is that you continue to give it dynamic. You continue to give it energy. Now, the word that usually passes in English translations for this is desires. Kama. Kama. Kama Sutra. Sometimes it's translated as craving, but craving in Sanskrit is tanha, not kama at all. And tanha is insidious because it means that you've developed a taste for something. When you have a taste for sugar, everything has to have sugar in it. You have a taste for salt, everything has to have salt in it. When you have a taste for something that's yours, everything has to have yours in it. Whereas kama is a little bit different. It isn't tanha, it isn't craving. But kama is like barter. It's like changing. It's like exchanging. It's just like I'm going to give you something, you're going to give me something. We're both satisfied. So that kama has a very peculiar quality to it, which tanha, which craving, does not have. It has this quality of co-opting someone else into the scenario. It has, in fact, all of the appearance trappings of reciprocity. And what cinches that reciprocity of kama together is the conviction that identification is a sign of the real. And because we have both agreed to do this together, this must be not only real but good. Kama. Not karma, not tanha, but kama. Not klisa. Klisa is imperfection. It's very specific. In order to not do this, in order to not be caught up in kama like this, one has to understand on deep level that identification is no guarantee whatsoever of objective reality. A equals A is not real. It's only provisional. A can be quite existent. A can also be non-existent. And those two recognitions together can make A real. But it's quite different from this other. So if the Buddha says, in the second part of the Dhammapada, he says, distinctly understanding this difference, distinctly understanding this difference. What is the difference? The difference between heedfulness and heedlessness. Full and less. Full and less. Sometimes it's called greater and lesser. In Sanskrit, it's called greater is maha and lesser is kula. Maha and kula. So very often in the deep wisdom lectures of the Buddha, he would give a pair of lectures, one called the Maha something or other, and then the next one would be the Kula something or other. In the Majjhima Nikaya, which I did a series of 13 lectures on one time, there's a whole series of these together, and one of these is the greater discourse on emptiness, and there's also a lesser discourse on emptiness. One of them is the greater discourse on the lion's roar. There is a lesser discourse on the lion's roar. There's a greater discourse at the time of the full moon. There's a lesser discourse on the time of the full moon. Why? Why all these pairings? Why all this together? Because the penetration, the taint, the tint, the taste, the tanha, the kama of ignorance is as deep as it goes. How deep does it go? It permeates the entire neurophysiological system. Now you say, well, wait a minute. Whoa! If it penetrates and permeates the entire neurological physical system, how do we then ever free ourselves from that? Answer me that. And turning to the cab driver who is really just Mara, you say that's very, very easy. Because you can exhaust the neurophysical system. You can carry it to a point of exhaustion. And it quits, but you don't. One of the worst of all yogas is the yoga of pure terror. You may have heard it from the Midwest American version of it. It's called frightened out of your wits. When you're frightened out of your wits, you leave your wits behind. Savvy? You leave your wits behind. You're still there. That's the hell of it. For one instant. And then that's the beauty of it. You can terrorize a neurological, physical system like this body, like this psyche. You can fill it right up to the top. And it fills right up to the top. But it stops right there. The hairs stand up to try and carry it higher, and it stops right there at the split ends. But you don't. You float right above that. That's the Saharastra chakra. It floats above that. It's immune. That whole ocean that's in complete hurricane turmoil has absolutely no effect whatsoever. This is a quality which is there constantly in the way in which the Buddha uses language. Constantly there. But you have to bring it into actuality by the way in which your hearing cuts the language. Your hearing has to be the jewel cutter. It's very difficult to be a jewel cutter and speak it. That takes very high dharma. But almost anyone can learn to be jewel cutter by hearing. Thus, all of the sermons of the Buddha, no matter what they are, and they remembered some thousands of them, they all began, "Thus have I heard." So in the Vajrayana in Tibet, the very first word in every sutra, every sermon of the Buddha, is the Tibetan word for thus. Evam. Evam. And Evam became a mantra due to genius of Atisha and his school. Thus. Thusness. Because thusness is like tathata. It's like suchness. Thusness. And when one can carry beyond thusness, fill thusness up so that its form is completely filled, and you know it is filled. Not only is your body confirming it's filled, but your psyche confirms it's filled, something else occurs, a mystery. But that something else is not a something. So that the Buddha, in using his language to say this, says it this way. Heedfulness is the path to deathlessness. Heedlessness is the path to death. The heedful do not die. The heedless are like unto the dead. Distinctly understanding this difference, the wise in heedfulness rejoice in heedfulness, delighting in the realm of the noble ones. The constantly meditative, ever earnest striving ones realize. What do they realize? Instead of the body and the psyche, they realize an other pair on the other shore. Why do they not realize the body and the psyche? Because one has left that behind. Where have you left it? What do they realize? They realize a pair. They realize the constantly meditative and the ever earnest striving at the same time. Word for this starts with familiar word yoga, yoga, but it's pronounced in Sanskrit Yogakkema. Yogakkema. It means free from all four bonds at the same time. What four bonds? It's free from kama. It's free from bhava. Oh, wait a minute. We talked a little bit about kama. Kama is a reciprocity that cinches a desire causality into seemingly strong bond. That's kama. What about bhava? Bhava is the binding of existence. Any trace whatsoever of ritual is like a spot of the glue, and that binds. And when you dissolve all the glue of existence, bhava, those bonds are not there. They don't operate at all. The reciprocity of the causality of agreed upon desire doesn't operate. Kama doesn't operate. Bhava doesn't operate. The glue of existence no longer holds. What's the third? The third bond is dithi. It's translated usually as false views, and what it means is the myths in the worst derisive sense. The myths that one would believe about all of this or any of it or nothing or everything. The entire mythological quality of it dissolves. Where does it go? It goes into a differential form called history. Where does kama go? It goes into a differential form called conscious vision. Where does bhava go? Where does existence go? It goes into a differential form known as art of spirit person. Well, then what's the fourth bond? The fourth bond is avijja. Avijja means ignorance. Vijnana means consciousness. Vijna is being able to see within. Perception, seeing, is sare, but vijna is vijnana. It's consciousness, conscious seeing. Vijja, it's seeing consciously. And not to be able to see consciously is ignorance. Avijja is ignorance. It means having no way to see other than depending upon eyes, and eyes on very reductive, simplistic level. So the four bonds, the ignorance, the avijja of symbols is displaced by what? By cosmos. The links of derisive mythology, the false views, are dissolved into history. History as that process which is chronology recut into the gems of personal reality. All of this, all four, kama, bhava, dithi, avijja. The causality desire, the existence glue, the false views, ignorance, all of this collapses at the same time. And as it collapses in upon itself, it leaves absolutely no trace. The reality, not the fact that it leaves no trace, but the reality of no trace, the Buddha calls that nirvana. It's not a that, but that conditionlessness is nirvana. Nir means leaving, and vana means attachments. It means leaving attachments completely, totally, in that one not only doesn't have attachments, but one doesn't have one. So that the entire reductive telescoping quality of integration no longer obtains. Not that it doesn't work, it just doesn't obtain. It doesn't happen. How then is anything real secured in this very peculiar meta realm? How is there anything? How does anything happen? It happens by another process that comes into play. It's like that. That other process that comes into play is that snowflake of the paramitas. I'll just give it to you the way that ancient tradition used to give it. They used to give 3 paramitas to children and animals so that they could have a way to deal with the perils of this world. And then those 3 beginning paramitas, when they mature, are the other 3 paramitas. You can teach children patience, you can teach them givingness, and you can teach them what normally is translated as morality, but it isn't morality, it's just keeping the sense of order that's natural to them. Like, it's very hard to get really little kids to lie. Whereas after a while it's very easy, they lie all the time. But initially they don't like to lie, they don't like to steal. Why? Because it's sila, the natural order of things. If you give them something to eat, they put it in their mouth, not their ear or other orifices. Whereas when they get conniving, they put it in all the other orifices except the mouth. It's a peculiar quality, but you can rely on sila, on this kind of order. Not morality so much, but a kind of an order process. You can rely on kshanti, which is patience, and you can rely on dana, which is giving. And when they mature, patience matures into strength. It's called virya. And sila matures into focusedness, concentration. It matures into dhyana. And dana, givingness, matures into prajna, into wisdom. Why? Because prajna is a differential form, and givingness is not giving things, and it's not just a process of giving. It's certainly not a reciprocity. It's giving with capital G. As Maimonides said in his great code, the highest charity is that no one knows who gave and no one knows who received. All that's there is the differential fact that there's a whole process of freeness that lubricates the world of the spirit. And instead of things being bogged down in the ignorant clingingness of egotistic possessiveness, they're free form, flowing in all the mysterious channels of the spiritual realm. And when human beings are there in that realm, well, that's another story.